So one thing, I mean, in JPL, we love randomized experiments, but not usually random experiments carried out in macroeconomics. It's one of the things we don't recommend is one morning change your money supply by 86%. Or so. That's not one of the recommended policies. And indeed, it's something that is fortunately rare in the world. But when you have them, they're really interesting because, thankfully they don't happen often. So you could learn quite a lot from them if you get a chance. That doesn't mean we should have them, but it certainly helps to understand the way economics work. It's also, I think, topical so that's sort of the big picture maybe. It's also topical because it's something, it'll get you to, or get us to something that I think is of interest also in the local context, which is, does bad economics make good politics? And that's something that we'll come back to at the end. So let me jump in. So what's demonetization? Well, on the 8th of November, when other strange things also happened in the world, you may remember them, there was the government of India decreed that all current 500 and 1,000 rupee bills will be immediately demonetized, meaning they had no more change value. You could deposit them in a bank till the end of the year, but there was you're not allowed to use them for transactions. You could presumably give it to people, but not transact with them. There was also an evolving policy conversation that involved, what would be, constraints on this process, and one that I think will be important for what I'm going to say, that eventually it emerged that any deposits of over 250,000 rupees will be potentially subject to some investigation. So it was it was not only that you couldn't hold on to the cash, but that it would also, if you put it in the bank, which was legal, they might actually come after you. So that sort of put you in something of a bind if you had many rupees. That was the intention. I'll come back to why. The immediate policy announcement was that right after they will start issuing new bills, and there was a new 500 rupee bill and a new 2,000 rupee bill. It's interesting. I'll come back to why that might be relevant. Now, it was a kind of the implementation was imperfect. There was about a quarter of right at the beginning, the amount of money cash that was available was a quarter of what it had been demonetized. So suddenly there was just not enough money. I went to the bank, I asked for some money, and they said, we have had no cash in our bank for the last 3 days. And that was a normal state of affairs for many days. ATMs where you could take out money, but that was capped at 2,500 rupees, and many ATMs also didn't have any money. So there was all kinds of reasons why this happened. One was that they hadn't actually somehow managed to print all the money that they needed. Second, they actually, oddly enough, had changed the format of the bills so that the ATM machines could not actually dispense the 2,000 rupee bill, which made it a little bit harder to replace the money. And then there was lots of encouragement to use electronic money instead. There was a massive expansion of the use of electronic money, 14 million subscriptions to Paytm, which is the biggest mobile wallet company, in just the month of November. So that's 14 million is more than the population of many countries. So it's a lot of action. So why did they do it? So it was not wonderfully implemented, and it's not exactly a normal thing to do. I mean, there are many currencies often demonetized, but usually with warning. You're told that over this period, we will phase out this money and then we'll introduce a new money. And that's happened in India a couple of times before and has happened in many other countries. It's not an unusual thing to do. It was the timing that was unusual. So what were the arguments given? Well, one was that Pakistan was printing counterfeit currency to finance terrorism. That was the first explanation provided. It didn't convince many people, since it seemed to imply that Pakistan couldn't buy enough Indian currency on the world markets to finance terrorism. It just didn't seem plausible. After you thought about it for about 20 seconds, you would think that one, I mean, the world, it's a traded currency, just go to the market, buy it. It's not so much money. So that wasn't going to convince people. So the next idea was that you're going to get rid of what in India is called black money. So people have stocks of money which are, illegally acquired or illegally held on to. So either money you got as a bribe or money that you didn't pay taxes on. So this generic category of black money, the corrupt hold black money. So I think as a stock statement, that's presumably true. We'll come back to whether it made sense as a policy. And then that was the second story. That story started to wear thin for reasons I'll come back to in a minute. So then the third story emerged. The third story was that people should be using electronic money. Electronic money is better. And related to that was the idea that it was good to get people into the formal economy. It's good to get people in a place where their transactions can be taxed, for example. So that at least was made sense. Finally, there was the idea that, well, since all these corrupt people, they're not going to dare to put the money back into the bank. Remember, there was this investigation clause that the government is going to gain a lot of resources because the money won't come back to the bank. Since it doesn't come back to the bank, the government will basically money is a kind of a debt of the government, and so the government will have to get to default on a part of its debt, and that would be very good for the government. So that was the last argument that was brought out. Now, most of these arguments are not super watertight. I already mentioned that the idea that there's no reason you should definitely do things about counterfeiting, but you don't need to do it all at once. So that didn't seem to be the right argument. On corruption, what's a bit bizarre is that they issued the 2,000 rupee bill. That seemed like an odd thing to do because in the end, what we care is not so much about the stock of black money, but about the flow. The fact that I can go to somebody and say, pay this money under the table to me. But making the bills 2,000 rupee bills instead of 1,000 rupee bills just makes that easier. Your suitcase has to be smaller if the bills are more valuable. So that didn't seem to be quite the right argument either. Moreover, it turned out that it created a new class of the corrupt. These were bankers who were basically, lots of bankers in these months, you heard a lot of reports of bankers being arrested and indicted. And the reason was that there was a huge incentive to basically launder money. So to replace black money by white money, and to do that without acknowledging who the money belonged to. So there was a lot of incentive to do so, and as you might expect, people did it a lot, and as a result, the government, of course, found some 250 bankers, I think, were indicted as a result of this, but I'm sure many, many thousands of them were involved in this process. So that actually increased corruption in at least one group. I think the argument that you should get people into the formal system is a perfectly good argument, but it didn't require demonetization. Singapore does it by, for example, rewarding you get a lottery ticket every time you take a receipt. Every receipt is a lottery ticket, and as a result, people have an incentive to get receipts, which is essentially the key piece of formalization. So there are many ways to do it. And finally, the fiscal gains was just bad economics. Because what the government hadn't quite figured out was that, yes, these people will be, maybe some of the money won't come back, But on the other hand, the demand for money, precisely because of for electronic use, the demand for money falls. So if the demand for money falls, then the amount of money that could be sustained in the economy without creating inflation goes down. And so as a result, the amount of money the government could keep outside had to naturally go down if it went to create inflation, precisely because the government was forcing people to not use money. And if people stopped using money, then the total stock of money that existed would be too much for the transactions that were available, which would create inflation. So if you had to keep inflation down, you would actually reduce the supply of money. So this would not, again, this argument wasn't quite thought through. And like most of this intervention, it was not based on a lot of careful consultation of J-PAL economists, let's say. There was also, on the other side, so that's on the upside of the policy, which seemed at least not obvious. On the downside, there was a concern that 85% of the labor force in the informal sector, these people basically transact in cash. So what are they going to do? There were actually lots of people, interestingly, you see this, and this was much celebrated in that 30,000 merchants every day were converting to Paytm. But remember, India has 100 million merchants or something like that, or some order of magnitude. So 80,000 was 30,000 a day wasn't getting you very far to that. So it's wasn't. So there were lots of people who couldn't pay, and that had the consequence that it could possibly have very large effects, because it's not just that I can't pay someone. When I can't pay someone, that person can't pay someone, that person then, the next person can't pay the next person, and so on. These are what are called liquidity cascades. And so you might actually see very large effects. So that was one of the concerns that economists had. Oops. So let's see. Yeah. So what happened? Let's. So we have some data on some of the things, and I'll try and explain where they came from. So one thing that happened was that all the money came back. This was part of the reason why the bankers went to jail. Is that essentially all the money, it was so much money came back that the Reserve Bank decided that it was politically inconvenient to keep accounting for it, and the finance ministry basically shut down all revelation of how much money had come back. So after it crossed 95%, there was some mention that there might be double counting without an explanation of how the double counting would happen. And with that, all more further disclosures were stopped. And we don't know yet. I've been searching for the new number, but it hasn't come out yet. So my guess is that 100% of the money came back or something close to that. So there wasn't much, this whole story of, you had kind of have lots of potential fiscal gains wasn't really there. The banking system, peculiar enough, actually suffered as a result of this. Reason was that the banking system in India is broken. They have huge non-performing assets, which means people have for many years not paid their debts, and as a result, their capacity to lend is very limited, because essentially under the Basel III regulation, which no doubt you all read about every morning, but it's a regulation which says that the amount of debt you can issue is related to how much equity you have with the bank. And if the banks are basically bankrupt, then they don't have a lot of equity. So now what happens but banks were forced to accept the cash that was coming into it. So as cash came into the banking sector, the bank was acquiring cash without being able to lend it. So the banking sector went from being pretty close to bankrupt to even closer to bankrupt. That was the next thing that happened. There was I think it's true that people who had large stocks of cash, I think lost something, but the price of that actually came down pretty fast. This is not something that I actually have personally traded, but I know a lot of people in business, and they said that at the beginning, you would have to give up 30 cents for every a rupee, 30 paisa for every rupee you traded in, but that came down to 10 paisa fairly fast. So, and towards the end, it was close to zero. So, people who were patient enough didn't lose very much, but no doubt, I think some people lost. But as I was saying before, while you might feel good about the fact that these guys who were holding on to this illegal cash got hurt, that's not what matters for economic efficiency. What matters for economic efficiency is, in the future, will there be less incentive to do something illegal? And the incentive to do something illegal in the future was, if anything, enhanced and not reduced because of the introduction of the 2,000 rupee bills. So now, remember, I said that this could have big GDP effects. So recently, the GDP results came out, and it fell from a projected 7.4% to a projected 7.1%. And the government was triumphant. The boss of the finance ministry declared, as you can see, the numbers completely negate the kind of negative projections and speculations that were made about the impact of demonetization. Except that despite being the boss of the finance ministry, he actually doesn't know how GDP is computed. The way GDP is computed in India and in many other countries is that you take the formal sector GDP, which you can easily get because it comes from the accounting statements of the profit and loss accounts of firms, which are quarterly submitted, so you can compute the formal sector GDP. How do you compute the informal sector GDP? Remember, there are millions and millions of fruit sellers. Nobody's going around asking them how much they sold. The way you compute GDP is the informal sector GDP is every 5 years you do something called the economic census. From the economic census, you basically establish a relationship between how much is traded in the formal sector and how much is traded in the informal sector. That's a number, so you multiply the GDP of sectoral GDP in the formal sector by a constant to get informal sector GDP. So if formal sector GDP doesn't fall because formal sector is not affected by this, then informal sector GDP doesn't fall. That's mechanical. That has no, and in fact, the government, being even-handed, it puts out something called the Annual Economic Survey. It's an excellent document. And in that document, there is a paragraph which says the GDP numbers are going to be wrong for this reason. So the reason I explained is not that I had to think it through. It was known by people in the finance ministry, but not by the finance minister. So, as a result, the government was triumphant, and people, and this is part of what I think is interesting, people were, this is not the problem is that the nuances of these things are often lost in the media. So the media was also a bit baffled, but willing to accept the government's claim. And in some ways, it actually suggests that knowing some economics is actually sometimes useful. We decided to go about it a different way. To get some survey data. So this is work with Namrata, who's sitting over there. So what we did was we surveyed 400 sellers, either retailers or wholesalers in 30 Bangalore wholesale markets. So basically what that graph shows is the proportion of people. We asked them, how much did your sales drop? That's sort of kind of a crude way to do it. We asked them in different ways, and they say that, well, on average, our sales dropped by 23%. This is the distribution. So some people said about 30% said no drop, and then the rest say up to 100% drop. So some people had disastrous outcomes, other people had some losses. We can also look at this by, it turns out that you can get data of sales of at least the major commodities in wholesale markets, the total sales. So you can actually look at that, and you can compare that with what would be the predicted sales based on past years. So in past years, you could fit a model to the past years, and based on that, you can predict how much the sales would have been. Relative to that, we find a 20% reduction. So very consistent with these numbers. So we can also check other things. So we asked them, you know, so 10% say that, you know, they were, so these are the fall in how, you know, number of people you're buying from. So 10% less new suppliers, 16% old suppliers, 14% very old suppliers. So they're buying from fewer people. I mean, this is just a sanity check on the data. Are they buying from different people? And why are you buying less? Well, again, they say, no, people can't have no money to buy, and I have no money to pay the suppliers. Those are the two main answers. That's sort of what you'd expect. They don't have money. That's why they don't buy. So all of this kind of makes sense. There were other costs. So one general measure is that, you know, there was at least in this market, we find this sort of 20% number, 20% reduction in transactions. I did my own informal surveying in some Delhi wholesale markets, and there the number, this was early in November, early in December, and they were saying 30% lower. But that order of magnitude keeps coming up. So I think that's probably not an implausible number. There were 54, a very different thing that also happened. There was a 54 rule changes in 52 days. Actually, not in 52 days, in 43 days. In the first 43 days, they changed the rules for what you could do. So you know, every day you would change the limit to how much you can take out, the conditions under which you can take it out or not, whether it's, you know, it's okay to take out money for, how much money can you take out for your daughter's wedding, you know, and there were newspaper headlines on all these things every day. And the rules kept changing, partly because people are very inventive. So every time some rule came out, there was a loophole in it. Somebody found the loophole and started trading on it, and then they plugged that loophole, and then on TV there'll be announcements. So there was a great deal of confusion. To see how confused people were, we went to Odisha is a state in India, kind of a poorer state on the southeast coast, and we went there to ask whether. We tried to figure out what people knew. So one of the things we could do is we could see if people knew the rule. The rule was that if you had a 500 rupee bill, you could deposit it till the 30th of December. And you would get 500 rupees credited to your account. So we could check if people were willing to take a gift of 500 rupees. So we gave them a choice between a gift of 500 rupees and a gift of 200 rupees. This is not a small amount of money, or 200 rupees was the daily wage. So this is a big amount of money. The difference between the gift of 500 rupees and the gift of 200 rupees is basically 1.5 days' wages. So that's a significant amount of money. We offered it to them. Now, there were, of course, some concerns. Let me just, you might think that people actually might think that it's going to take a long time to exchange in the bank, but it's not true. The actual time was 16 minutes. They thought that it would take 27 minutes, and the time to the nearest bank is about 21 minutes. So the total transaction in minutes was about 39 minutes. If you add these two up, you get 48 minutes. So it's not, they had a reasonable sense of how long it would take. The actual facts were a little better than they thought it was. They imagined things were worse than they are. But in the end, within an hour, you could get a day and a half wages. So then the question is, how many people took which offer? So that's the, let me just go back to the answer. So the answer is 8% took. So there was, in other words, there was lots of confusion about the rules. Essentially, nobody wanted to touch this 500 rupee bill, and the reason why they didn't want to touch it is basically you can't deposit it anymore. It's illegal to hold it. It's black money, etc. So people, and my guess is that this is a symptom of something that happened very generally. There's lots of confusion, and as a result, probably a lot of reasonable economic transactions fell through. Now, this is the kind of the economic picture. I'm actually going to, so now it's interesting how it was received. So on the big picture, in the press, people said this is a bold move, and it was, I think the general view was it's popular. That was very much confirmed, at least superficially, by the elections last month when Mr. Modi's party did very well. And indeed, when we surveyed people, we got very similar answers. So this is from our Bangalore subjects, and you give them choices between, it's a good thing for the country and not too bad for me, good for the country but very bad for me, good for the country, bad for me, slightly bad for me, it's a bad thing for the country, good for me, not bad, sorry, good, bad for the country, not bad for me, and bad for the country, bad for me. And essentially nobody said it's bad for the country, bad for me. It's people were all only willing to say it's good for the country. Okay. This is from a different survey. It's from Orissa. And people, this is on a scale of 1 to 5. When you ask them the economic question, is it good for the, is it good for you and bad for you? Basically, on a scale of 1 to 5, most people say, 36% it's bad, really bad for me. But then when you ask them, is demonetization good for me, in some aggregated sense, 61 say, yes, it's good for me. So in some sense, people wanted to believe it's good for them. So it's you feel maybe they were wanted to say, we don't know whether it was because they were scared of revealing their real feelings, but certainly everybody's view was that this is a good policy. Even if they were, when you ask them individually on what happened, they say it hurt. Now one explanation, well, what are the explanations of why they would say that? Well, one, I think they might just say that, this is brave policy. Bold was a word you hear a lot, and this was, bold is not necessarily mean good in my view, but nonetheless. And in particular, it was striking that this actually hurt the trading classes, which were the BJP's core constituency. So maybe for that reason, it was seen as very brave. Maybe people were confused about benefits. Maybe people were happy that other people got hit. So let me go back to that one fact, which I said, which is that, people, 35% of the people got fives. Fives said that, it hurt me 5. We also asked them, did it hurt other people? And who did they think it really hurt? Moneylenders and politicians. So their theory, one possible interpretation of what happened was their theory was that, yes, it hurt me, but it's good for me because it hurt those other guys more. So now, before I conclude, one last thing we did was we actually tried to see what the effect was on vote shares. The way we wanted to do it is that, again, go back to what I said before, which is we can take the data at the wholesale market level. We can predict how much sales would happen at the market using the past years and this year's rainfall. We could use this. We know the rainfall in this year. Every year, rainfall, higher rainfall or has effects on crops. So crops. So you need the rainfall in the local area, and you can predict basically how much. So Namrata and I did this exercise. On average, the number comes back very nicely. The actual sales is 20% lower than predicted sales. So that 20% number comes back quite solidly again. And prices are about 86% of predicted prices. So prices of crops fell because people couldn't buy, presumably. We look at the effect of actual sales. How much was sold in this market, controlling for predicted sales. So, the reason why you want to control for predicted sales is because after the difference is in geography. Some places the farmers are richer. They're going to have more output, and maybe they are more supportive of a right-wing party. So you may observe spurious correlation between the vote share and the actual sales. So we want to purge that. So we use predicted sales to purge that, and then look at the effect of actual sales. And the effect of actual sales is a small negative effect. Small positive effect. So if you sell more, controlling for predicted sales, then you are more likely to vote for the BJP. So in other words, there was a small punishment for demonetization overall, where controlling for predicted sales, actual sales was lower. The BJP did slightly worse. This is the party of Modi. But overall, to be honest, it's so small that it's hard to take much solace from it. So mostly, and in particular, it's worth understanding that this kind of exercise compares places where prices fell by 5% with places where prices fell by 10%. The overall shift is not captured by it, because the overall shift happens everywhere. So that's not going to be picked up by this exercise. When I compare a place where prices fell by 5% and a place where prices fell by 10%, I'm just picking up the effect of that difference. I'm not picking up if the entire state, and there were people who were full of admiration for Mr. Modi and as a result voted for the BJP, that's not going to be picked up by that. That's uniform everywhere and therefore will not vary. So at best, this is a tiny bit of solace, but overall, I would say that there is not much reason to believe that they didn't get away with it. That's double negative. Let me say it again. I think my interpretation of this evidence is that the bad economics probably turned into good politics. So I'll stop there on that rather maybe grim note. So I guess we can have questions for floor or from the people who are online, but maybe one from the floor first.
So relating directly to what you just said, is there any more high-frequency data, such as approval ratings of Modi, that we could then look at either side of November 8th, or anything that could proxy basically for support for BJP, and then try and capture that shift?
Maybe. There is the Gallup poll, so you could look at that. Not approval. There's no approval ratings. We don't have the approval ratings. Yeah.
So zooming back out to the reasons for the policy, if Arun Jaitley were to call you, say, Professor Banerjee, we really want to increase the income tax base, and demonetization didn't do it, what should they try next?
So I think many things. For one, I think that there is the income tax base. Every year they shrink by policy. In a sense, we've been complaining about this for many years. That every year what they basically do is they say that we're going to raise the bottom slab. So I think the simplest thing would have been in about 2000, if they had frozen the bottom slab by growth and inflation, the entire income tax base would have been much bigger. So I think there is sort of this idea that somehow what we need to do is, it's desperate and therefore we need to do something extreme, is inconsistent with what they do every year. This year they raised the slab so that nobody under 500,000 rupees pays any taxes. But that's sort of by design, in a sense. I think the simplest thing to do would be to hold the slab for a few years so that people come into the tax net. I think a lot of it is also getting used to the fact of paying taxes. And once you start paying, maybe it's not so much, you don't feel the pain as much as, I think, ex ante, when you think that this is going to be something that's going to come down on you like a ton of bricks.
have a question from the web audience about the study that you presented. So they wanted to know if there might be some kind of moral reasoning why people didn't take the $500 rupee notes, and so much of the narrative was about the morality behind the decision making.
It might be, except that that's not what they said. They said it's illegal. They didn't say it's immoral. I didn't hear that answer. That was a possible answer. Yeah.
You mentioned the wholesale is a 20% reduction in the sales. That should reflect the formal economy and then hence the GDP. Why did it not?
So I think it did a little bit. I mean, there are, the economic survey actually has this nice graph which shows that the thing that crashes right after demonetization is sales of two-wheelers. Scooters, motorcycles, etc. This is a typical product that an affluent, informal businessman will buy. And so, in fact, you do see those things crashing. So it's not obvious to me that you won't see a more delayed but continuing effect of this, because partly that will have an effect with a lag also.
So there's been considerable talk about demonetization around the world in high and low-income countries, and I wonder if you could comment on, given I think especially this point that questionable economics may actually have translated into fairly good politics, what lessons India's experience at this point, 5 and 6 months out, might imply for other countries that are considering a similar move?
Print the bills before you start. That's a good one. Don't change the format without telling the ATMs. I mean, the particular implementation was so bizarre that it's hard to have generalizable lessons. I mean, most people wouldn't think of doing what they did. I don't know why they didn't get the money printed in Switzerland or someplace before they did it. It's just, I'm a bit baffled by the level of implementation. Yeah.
Do you think if it was executed well, then it would have been a better policy?
If it were executed well. So I think that if getting rid of the 1,000 rupee bill might be a good idea. I think that would be the first, it would make it harder to, dispense large amounts of cash. It would make it a little bit more obvious. So I think that would probably be a good idea. I think the reason they introduced the 2,000 rupee bill, and we have on somewhat reliable authority, is that they suddenly realized that they can't print enough 100 rupee bills. So that's why so I think bad planning was at the heart of the story. And so I think one thing they could have done is just printed lots of 100 rupee bills and given them out, and then that would have presumably made it harder to, the suitcase would have had to be much bigger to pay off the, make the illegal payment. So I think that would have helped. So yes, I mean, there are things that you could definitely do along these lines that would be good.
My second question, so I'm not an economics student, so when I first heard about this thing, the impression I had in my mind was that it would actually might help digitization in India. As you mentioned, 14 million users were subscribed to Paytm in just a single month. If not this, I don't know how many years it would have taken to get to that number, but since it has already been done, what other things that you see should be done in order to bring more, to propagate this culture in India? Because even though India has so many smartphone users, not many people trust online transactions. What should be done? I feel lottery system that you mentioned in Singapore would be a little harder to implement for 1 billion population.
I think that the way it's implemented in Singapore is that whenever you transact, if you get a bill, that's a lottery ticket. So, I mean, in some sense, everybody is supposed to issue a receipt for every transaction. So I think it's more that, there isn't, and I think making it electronic is a good idea there, because I think it will be much easier to issue a bill. You don't have to print anything, it just come electronically. So you could implement it very easily actually on the Paytm platform. So if you want to implement incentives, I would say putting it on the Paytm platform and saying that, every time you transact, we put your phone number into a lottery, and you have some chance of winning. I think that will be very easy to implement, actually. I think it's precisely, you don't need a paper receipt, and you automatically get your Paytm receipt, so you have all of them, and so those are all your lottery entries. So you could do that. I mean, I think that it's also clearly, if the government really wanted to have tax enforcement, I mean, it's absolutely obvious that you can walk into a store and not pay taxes. And so, if there was a will to do it, then you could easily have, basically mystery shoppers showing up and seeing if the receipts get issued, and then, going after the people who don't issue receipts. I think this seems like a very inefficient way to go there. If you really wanted to enforce indirect tax payments, you could just have mystery shoppers go into the store. And even if the mystery shopper, only comes once in a while, I think it would create enough panic that many people will sign up.
Do you see any noteworthy effects of demonetization on direct benefit transfer schemes, specifically in the health sector, such as males getting vasectomies or institutional births where they get the Janani Suraksha Yojana cash transfer?
I think, so answer is no, I haven't even checked. I don't know how to check even, because it's not that, I mean, this is a nationwide program, so it's not the case that, it's not the demonetization doesn't change that. They're entitled to the payment, and there was no sort of change in rules with respect to them. So there was not that I suddenly started paying people by electronic money. The DBT is still made into their bank accounts now, or in some states are paid in cash. So either way, it's just not part of the policy frame. So I don't have an answer to that, but I don't think it was what the government didn't make that connection. So I don't think anything changed there.
So I think in terms of a lot of the economics and the political impacts, in a sense, demonetization is history now. But I wonder if you can talk about the one thing, I think, the fiscal impact which will continue, which is the fact that the government now knows every single person who deposited money into the bank. So in a sense, a lot of money came into the bank, and now everything is linked to your Aadhaar card. So if the government effectively wanted to do that, you could actually increase the tax base, like the person said earlier, by asking these people, how did you manage to find 3 lakh rupees to deposit into your bank account when the last 10 years you never had any stated income?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that so that's why I think that 250,000 rupees was, lots of things came in just under 250,000.
That's why they actually changed the rules, right? They're saying we're going to investigate anything over 2, not 250.
Yeah, right.
So
you can pull that once. The next time you try to pull that, it's going to be harder. But yeah, so I think they probably will be able to send. I mean, it's not that they didn't know who had money. I think the fact that the capacity to investigate individual acts of telling misreporting is just not there. So I actually don't think this changes it. I think the information. So what? Are you going to go after 50 million people? I mean, they don't have the capacity to investigate them and establish that they have actually done something illegal. I just don't think it's there. So the reason why it doesn't happen, I never understood why people think that, just knowing that somebody has the money. So if you made it a law which says that anybody who has more than a certain amount, we will throw them in jail, that would surely frighten people, but that would probably not survive the Supreme Court. And otherwise, it's still the IRS basically doesn't have the capacity to investigate anything like that many people, even if the IRS wasn't totally corrupt. So I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that without fixing the IRS, you could go after that many people. I just don't think the order of magnitude just seems so enormous.
In your perspective, do you think there's a need in India at all for a digitization of economy? Because that seemed like a strong debate on why this whole thing happened. And digitization of the economy, it's based on the precondition that be smartphone, that be internet, that be bank branches, that be accessibility, which is not true for most part of the rural India. So is there a need at all to convert into a digital economy for the masses? Of course, there'd be certain part of the society which would benefit.
So I guess it depends on the cost. I suspect that, there is a reasonable case to be made for making it making transaction taxable, and I think one way to get them to be taxable is get them on an electronic platform. So I have some sympathy for the view that you should try. I also agree with you that for lots of people this is not really an option, though. To be honest, I was in kind of back of beyond near the Bangladesh border, almost like 3 miles from the Bangladesh border, just a week, 10 days ago, and your cell phone, your 4G worked just fine there. It's not. I think the connectivity is remarkably good now. So I guess you have the last question.
Okay, great. So someone was wondering about ways that you would suggest capturing more of the informal economy in GDP calculations.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So I think part of what has to happen is that in general the government has not invested at all in the statistical apparatus. So in some sense the local statistical offices, I think some of them are understaffed at 50% or more. So just there aren't people. So something that you have to do is you have to just hire people. The first order fact is you can't do it without people. I mean, the boots on the ground. So they need people to be able to go to a sample. I mean, in some ways, all of this was kind of understood for a long time. People used to do samples of these things, and we still do them for example, agriculture. There is actually a methodology of going and sampling at the mandis, the wholesale markets, to figure out how much was produced. So there is some for agriculture, for example, there is actually a way to do it. And you could do it for other things. You could go to the wholesale markets for example, fabric, where the garment makers buy and sample. This is not. I think the statistical apparatus has been ignored for the last 40 years, and as a result, it's in extraordinarily bad shape. And if you put resources into it, I think lots of things can be done.
All right, great. Thank you very much, everyone. Please join me in saying thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.